The funniest thing about being underestimated is that the people laughing the hardest rarely realize they are standing in the front row of your greatest success. That was the thought running through my mind on the evening my father looked across the dinner table, shook his head, and told me that no successful man would ever choose to live the way I did. At the time, I simply smiled, took another bite of my meal, and said nothing. Looking back now, silence was probably the strongest answer I could have given, because only a few days later, someone far more convincing than I could ever be would walk through a familiar doorway and change the way my family saw me forever. My name is Andrew Parker, and for most of my adult life, my family believed I had settled for an ordinary existence. They were not cruel people, but they measured success using the same yardstick as many others. They looked at the size of your house, the badge on your car, the logo stitched onto your jacket, and the neighborhood where you lived. If those things looked impressive, they assumed your life was impressive too. Unfortunately for them, and perhaps fortunately for me, I had spent years building a life that looked almost invisible from the outside. I drove a 12-year-old pickup truck that still ran perfectly because I saw no reason to replace something that continued doing its job. I rented a modest 2-bedroom townhouse instead of buying a large home because I preferred flexibility over appearances. My clothes came from ordinary department stores. My wrist had never carried an expensive watch. Most mornings began with coffee brewed in my own kitchen instead of purchased from fashionable cafes. To strangers, I probably looked like an average man earning an average living. To my parents, I looked like someone who had never fulfilled his potential. Family dinners became predictable over the years. My father, Thomas Parker, always found a way to compare my life with someone else's. One weekend, it was the son of his longtime friend who had just purchased a luxury sport utility vehicle. Another time, it was the neighbor's daughter who had accepted an executive position with a large corporation. Every success story eventually circled back to me, usually ending with a disappointed glance that suggested I could have accomplished more if I had only tried harder. My mother, Susan, rarely criticized me directly, but she often asked questions that carried the same message. Was I thinking about buying a nicer place soon? Had I considered upgrading my truck? Was my business doing well enough to support a family someday? She never intended to hurt me. She simply believed appearances reflected reality. My younger sister Emily fit naturally into the picture my parents admired. She and her husband owned a beautiful suburban home with freshly landscaped flower beds and a 3-car garage. They took vacations every summer, shared photographs of expensive restaurants on social media, and seemed to live the kind of life people admired at first glance. Every holiday gathering included stories about home improvements, luxury purchases, and career promotions. Whenever the conversation shifted toward me, the room became noticeably quieter. Nobody really knew what I did for a living. They knew I worked with businesses. They knew I owned a small office downtown. Beyond that, they assumed the details were probably not very exciting. The truth was much simpler than they imagined and far more complicated than they would have believed. I owned a boutique brand consulting firm. I helped companies redefine who they were, how they communicated with customers, and how they positioned themselves in competitive markets. My clients valued discretion above everything else. Many required confidentiality agreements before the first meeting ever took place. Protecting their privacy was not only good business. It was part of the trust they paid me to provide. Because of that, I rarely discussed my work outside the office. I never posted photographs with clients. I never announced major contracts online. I never felt the need to prove my value by displaying someone else's name beside mine. That quiet approach confused my family. In their minds, successful people enjoyed being noticed. I preferred letting my work speak where it mattered most. On that particular Sunday evening, my parents invited everyone over for dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the kitchen while familiar laughter echoed through the house where I had grown up. For a while, everything felt comfortable. Emily talked about remodeling their guest bathroom. My father discussed repairs at the automotive shop he had owned for nearly 30 years. My mother described plans for a neighborhood charity event. Then, almost without warning, my father looked toward the driveway through the dining room window and noticed my old pickup truck parked beside Emily's new sport utility vehicle. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that carried disappointment instead of humor. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Andrew, I still cannot understand why you insist on living like this. No successful man drives a truck that old or rents a place that small." Emily laughed softly, assuming everyone would find the comment harmless. My mother added that perhaps it was finally time for me to reward myself if business was going well. I looked around the table, meeting each pair of familiar eyes without feeling angry. Years earlier, I would have defended every decision I had made. I would have explained budgets, investments, priorities, and long-term planning. Experience had taught me that people only hear explanations when they are ready to question their assumptions. Mine were not. I simply smiled and replied, "I like my life exactly the way it is." My father sighed as though he had expected that answer. One day, he said, "I hope you stop settling for simple." I nodded politely because arguing would accomplish nothing. Deep inside, however, I already knew something they did not. Before the week ended, the most important client of my entire career would walk through the front door of my office, and by complete coincidence, my parents would be there to witness everything with their own eyes. Monday mornings always began the same way for me. I unlocked the glass door to my office a little before 7, switched on the lights, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, and spent the first quiet hour reviewing projects before the phone started ringing. My office was located on the second floor of a renovated brick building in the downtown business district. It was not large. There was a modest reception area with comfortable chairs, a conference room that seated 6 people, 3 private offices, and a small break room overlooking the street below. Nothing about the space looked extravagant. There were no marble floors, no oversized company logo covering the walls, and no luxury furniture designed to impress visitors. Every piece had been chosen because it was functional, durable, and paid for without unnecessary debt. People often assumed success had to look expensive. I believed success should first become sustainable. My company specialized in brand strategy, executive communication, and long-term business positioning. While many consulting firms chased hundreds of small accounts every year, I preferred working with a limited number of clients and building relationships that lasted for years. My calendar was rarely crowded with random meetings because every appointment represented months of planning before anyone ever walked through my door. That approach confused people who believed a busy office was automatically a successful office. There were days when my reception area remained completely empty, yet millions of dollars in business decisions were quietly taking shape inside my conference room. Confidentiality was one of the reasons clients trusted me. Every new engagement began with detailed agreements protecting sensitive information. Some companies were preparing acquisitions. Others were recovering from public relations challenges. Several were redesigning entire corporate identities before launching nationwide campaigns. Revealing their names would have violated the trust they placed in me, and I refused to treat someone else's reputation as advertising for my own business. That decision meant my family rarely heard stories about my work. From their perspective, silence looked suspicious. They assumed that if I never mentioned impressive clients, it was because impressive clients did not exist. My assistant, Rachel, understood the business better than almost anyone else. She had worked beside me for nearly 6 years and knew exactly how carefully every project was handled. One morning, she walked into my office carrying a folder filled with schedules for the coming month. She smiled before placing it on my desk. "You are turning down another interview request," she said. I looked up from my computer and nodded. A regional business magazine had invited me to discuss entrepreneurship, but I politely declined. Rachel laughed softly because she already knew my answer before asking. "Most consultants would love free publicity," she said. "Probably," I replied, "but publicity attracts attention. I would rather attract the right clients." She nodded in agreement because she had watched that philosophy shape the company from the beginning. We never chased recognition. We focused on producing results that encouraged satisfied clients to quietly recommend us to other business leaders. That strategy grew slowly, but it created relationships built on trust instead of marketing. Around lunchtime, I reviewed financial reports from the previous quarter. Revenue had exceeded expectations once again, yet my personal spending remained almost unchanged. My truck still worked perfectly. My townhouse still met every need I had. I preferred investing profits back into the business, expanding research capabilities, improving client resources, and maintaining financial security during uncertain markets. Growing wealth had never been about collecting expensive possessions. It had always been about creating freedom. That afternoon, my phone rang. The number belonged to my mother. She called simply to ask whether I planned on attending another family dinner the following weekend. During the conversation, she casually mentioned that my father still hoped I would eventually move into a larger house because, in her words, people respected success they could actually see. I smiled quietly before telling her that I would be there for dinner. After hanging up, I looked around my office. The room reflected every decision I had intentionally made. Nothing existed to impress strangers. Everything existed to serve clients well. Late that afternoon, Rachel knocked gently before entering again. This time her expression carried a level of excitement I rarely saw. She explained that someone from Whitmore Global Enterprises had called asking whether I could personally return the message before the end of the day. I immediately recognized the company. Whitmore Global was one of the fastest-growing consumer brands in the country, with operations across multiple states and a reputation for carefully selecting every outside consultant they hired. Rachel handed me a note containing a direct number along with one name written neatly across the top. Grace Whitmore. I had followed her career for years. She was known throughout the business community for transforming struggling companies into industry leaders through disciplined leadership and long-term vision. I closed my office door before returning the call. Grace answered personally after only 2 rings. Her voice was calm, confident, and remarkably direct. She explained that her executive team had spent months reviewing firms capable of leading an important brand transformation. My company had been recommended repeatedly by trusted executives who had worked with me in complete confidence. She said they were not looking for the largest consulting firm. They wanted someone whose judgment they believed could be trusted when difficult decisions needed to be made. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes about philosophy, leadership, and business culture without discussing money even once. Before ending the conversation, Grace asked whether she could visit my office later that week to continue the discussion in person. I gladly accepted. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several moments, recognizing that this opportunity could become the most significant partnership of my career. Outside my office window, the city continued moving as though nothing remarkable had happened. Cars passed below, pedestrians crossed the sidewalks, and the afternoon sun reflected against neighboring buildings. Everything appeared completely ordinary. Yet I could not help thinking about my father's words from the dinner table only one day earlier. He believed successful people needed to look successful before anyone believed in them. In just a few days, without planning it, and without trying to prove anything at all, life was preparing to challenge that belief in a way none of us could have imagined. As I prepared for Thursday's meeting with Grace Whitmore, I found myself thinking less about the opportunity ahead and more about the long road that had brought me there. Success rarely arrives in dramatic moments. More often, it is built through thousands of quiet decisions that nobody notices until years later. My family had only seen the outside of my life, and I could not blame them for misunderstanding what they never bothered to ask about. Years earlier, when I first decided to build my own consulting business, I had almost nothing beyond experience, determination, and a small amount of savings. Friends from college accepted comfortable corporate positions with generous salaries, company vehicles, and impressive job titles. They posted photographs from business conferences, expensive dinners, and luxury hotels. My father loved showing those pictures to relatives during family gatherings. He would smile proudly and say that those young professionals understood how to build successful careers. Then he would glance toward me with the same familiar expression that silently asked why I had chosen such an uncertain path instead. At that time, I worked from a tiny rented office barely large enough for 1 desk, 2 chairs, and a bookshelf. I answered my own phone calls, scheduled every appointment myself, and handled everything from client presentations to accounting after normal business hours. Some evenings I remained in the office until nearly midnight preparing proposals that I hoped would lead to future opportunities. Other days ended with polite rejection emails reminding me that building trust took longer than building ambition. During those first years, every dollar mattered. Instead of buying a newer vehicle after landing my first profitable contract, I paid off business expenses. Instead of upgrading my apartment, I invested in better software, research tools, and professional development courses. I believed the company deserved every advantage before I rewarded myself with personal comfort. My father interpreted those choices very differently. Whenever he saw my aging pickup truck, he assumed I simply could not afford anything better. He often reminded me that successful people should enjoy the rewards of their hard work. I understood what he meant, but I viewed rewards differently. Financial freedom had always seemed more valuable than visible wealth. I wanted my business to remain stable during difficult economic years, even if that meant appearing less successful during good ones. My mother worried in quieter ways. She sometimes asked whether I was working too hard for too little return. She wondered why I never talked about promotions or bonuses like everyone else. Explaining entrepreneurship to someone who had always measured careers through traditional employment proved surprisingly difficult. Success inside a privately owned business often remained invisible for years before becoming obvious overnight. Emily's life appeared to move much faster than mine. She and her husband purchased a beautiful home shortly after getting married. They upgraded vehicles every few years and celebrated each new milestone with photographs shared across social media. Family members admired how quickly they seemed to achieve the American dream. I genuinely felt happy for them. Their choices suited their lives perfectly. Mine simply followed a different direction. Rather than investing heavily in appearances, I invested in relationships with clients who valued trust above recognition. Over time, those relationships quietly became the strongest asset my company possessed. One recommendation led to another. One satisfied executive introduced me to another chief executive officer. Every completed project opened doors that no advertising campaign could have purchased. Because confidentiality remained essential, very few people outside my office knew which companies I worked with. That silence created a strange contradiction. The more successful my business became, the less visible my accomplishments appeared to people who judged success through public attention. Several months before Grace Whitmore contacted me, I attended another family gathering celebrating my parents' wedding anniversary. During dinner, one of my father's friends asked what I did for a living. Before I could answer, my father smiled politely and said that I worked with businesses somehow, although he admitted he was never entirely sure exactly what that meant. Everyone laughed lightly, including me, because correcting him would only have created a long explanation nobody genuinely wanted to hear. Later that evening, my father quietly suggested that perhaps I should consider joining a larger consulting firm instead of trying to build something on my own. He believed the stability, salary, and prestige would give me the future he wanted for me. I thanked him sincerely because I knew his advice came from concern rather than criticism. Still, I could not ignore one simple truth. Every meaningful opportunity in my career had appeared because I remained independent enough to make decisions according to my own principles rather than quarterly corporate targets. Back at the office, Rachel interrupted my thoughts with another update regarding Thursday's meeting. Grace Whitmore's executive assistant had confirmed the appointment for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Rachel also mentioned that Grace preferred arriving quietly without media attention or a large entourage. That detail did not surprise me. Truly accomplished leaders often cared more about productive conversations than impressive entrances. We spent the remainder of Wednesday preparing research materials, reviewing market reports, and organizing strategic recommendations specifically tailored to Whitmore Global Enterprises. Every document reflected weeks of careful preparation even before Grace had officially become a client. Excellence, I had learned long ago, should never begin after a contract is signed. It should already exist before the opportunity arrives. As I locked the office that evening, my phone vibrated again. My mother reminded me about another family lunch scheduled for Friday, joking that perhaps I would finally have some exciting business news to share. I smiled to myself while assuring her I would be there. She had no idea that less than 24 hours earlier, one of the most respected business leaders in the country would be sitting across the conference table in my modest office. More importantly, she had no idea that an unexpected twist of timing was about to place my parents directly in the middle of a moment none of us would ever forget. Thursday arrived with the kind of calm morning that often comes before an important turning point. I reached the office before sunrise, unlocked the front door, and walked through each room one last time to make sure everything was ready. The conference table was neatly arranged with research folders, market reports, and handwritten notes that reflected weeks of preparation. Fresh coffee filled the break room. The presentation screens had already been tested, and Rachel had confirmed every detail of the afternoon schedule. Nothing felt extravagant, yet everything reflected the standards I expected from myself. I had learned years ago that professionalism had very little to do with expensive furniture and everything to do with preparation, consistency, and respect for the people placing their trust in you. Around 9 o'clock, Rachel stepped into my office carrying her tablet. She smiled in the quiet way she always did whenever she had good news. "Grace Whitmore's assistant called again," she said. "They are leaving a little earlier than expected. They should arrive around 1:45 instead of 2. I thanked her and adjusted my schedule accordingly. The meeting itself was expected to last several hours, and I wanted every minute available for meaningful discussion rather than unnecessary formalities. Before returning to her desk, Rachel paused for a moment. "You know," she said, "I have watched this company grow for 6 years, and I have never seen you nervous before a client meeting." I laughed softly. "I am not nervous," I replied honestly. "I just understand how much responsibility comes with opportunities like this." She nodded because she understood exactly what I meant. Winning a major client was exciting, but earning their confidence was even more important than signing a contract. Shortly after 11 o'clock, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her cheerful voice immediately filled the room. She explained that she and my father had finished an appointment nearby earlier than expected and were planning to have lunch downtown before returning home. Then she asked a simple question that changed the direction of the entire afternoon. "Would you mind if we stopped by your office afterward?" she asked. "Your father keeps saying he has never actually seen where you work." For a brief moment, I considered suggesting another day. Not because I was embarrassed by my office, but because I knew how close their visit would come to Grace Whitmore's arrival. Still, there seemed to be no reason to refuse. They would probably stay only a few minutes before leaving. "Of course," I answered. "Come by around 1 if you would like." My mother thanked me warmly before ending the call. I looked at the clock and smiled to myself. Life often arranged strange coincidences that nobody could have planned. By 12:30, I had reviewed every presentation one final time. Rachel organized the reception area while I answered several routine emails. At exactly 1 o'clock, the elevator doors opened and my parents stepped into the office. My father looked around with polite curiosity while my mother admired the clean layout and large windows overlooking downtown. I greeted them warmly and offered coffee before giving them a brief tour. My father examined each room carefully. There was no criticism in his voice at first, only quiet observation. He walked into the conference room, looked at the simple wooden table, then glanced toward the modest reception area. Finally, he folded his arms and smiled in the familiar way I had seen so many times before. "It is smaller than I imagined," he said. "I thought consultants worked in buildings with marble floors and giant reception desks." I smiled without taking the comment personally. "The clients come here for advice," I replied. "The furniture has never seemed very important." My father chuckled lightly. "Maybe not, but first impressions matter. Successful businesses usually look more impressive than this." My mother gently agreed, suggesting that perhaps one day I would expand into a larger office now that business appeared steady. I simply nodded. There was no reason to explain that I had intentionally renewed my lease because I preferred investing capital into people and research rather than appearances. Those decisions had served me well for years. We continued talking for several minutes as my parents looked through framed photographs from company events and community projects hanging along one hallway. They noticed there were no pictures featuring famous executives or recognizable corporations. That was intentional. Client confidentiality had always come before personal recognition. My father shook his head with a friendly smile. "You really are different from most business owners," he said. "You never seem interested in showing anyone what you have accomplished." Before I could answer, Rachel appeared quietly at the conference room doorway. Her professional expression remained calm, but I immediately recognized the subtle excitement in her eyes. "Andrew," she said, "our guest has arrived a few minutes early." I thanked her and turned back toward my parents. "I appreciate you stopping by," I said. "I have an important meeting beginning now." My father glanced toward the reception area and smiled politely. "We should head out then. We do not want to get in the way of one of your clients." They started walking toward the front entrance just as the elevator doors opened again. I could not yet see who had stepped into the hallway, but I heard several confident footsteps approaching the office. Rachel straightened her posture, warmly welcomed our visitors, and held the glass door open. My parents instinctively paused beside the reception desk, expecting to politely step aside for an ordinary business appointment. None of us knew that within the next few seconds, a single introduction would quietly challenge years of assumptions my family had carried about the life I had chosen to build. The woman who stepped through the doorway looked exactly as she did in the business journals, except there was nothing theatrical about her presence. Grace Whitmore did not arrive surrounded by photographers, assistants, or security personnel. She entered with quiet confidence, carrying a slim leather portfolio and wearing a tailored navy suit that reflected professionalism rather than extravagance. Beside her walked one senior executive from her company and an executive assistant carrying a tablet. Rachel greeted them warmly before turning toward me. "Ms. Whitmore, welcome. Andrew has been expecting you." Grace smiled the moment our eyes met and crossed the reception area with an outstretched hand. "Andrew," she said, "it is a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Thank you for making time for us." I shook her hand and welcomed everyone into the office. Before leading them toward the conference room, I noticed my parents had stopped walking entirely. My father remained standing near the reception desk with an expression I had never seen before. He looked from Grace to me and then back again, as though trying to convince himself that what he was witnessing was real. My mother appeared equally surprised, although she remained politely silent. Grace noticed them immediately. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked with a friendly smile. "Not at all," I replied. "These are my parents, Thomas and Susan Parker. They were just visiting the office before your meeting." Grace immediately turned toward them and offered each of them a warm handshake. "It is wonderful to meet you both," she said. "You should be very proud of your son. I have heard remarkable things about his work from people whose opinions I trust deeply." For a brief second, nobody spoke. My father accepted the handshake almost automatically, still processing what he had just heard. My mother thanked Grace politely, but I could see questions filling her mind. She clearly recognized the name. Grace Whitmore had appeared in national business magazines, television interviews, and leadership conferences for years. Even people outside the corporate world knew who she was. After exchanging introductions, I invited everyone into the conference room. My parents quietly stepped aside, preparing to leave exactly as they had planned only moments earlier. Then Grace looked back toward them with another friendly smile. "If you have a few minutes before heading home, please do not feel rushed because of us," she said. "Andrew has spent months preparing for today's discussion. I have already appreciated his insight over the telephone, and I have been looking forward to this meeting all week." My father simply nodded. He no longer seemed interested in commenting on the size of the office or the furniture inside it. As Rachel escorted Grace's colleagues toward the conference room, my mother leaned closer and whispered quietly enough that only I could hear. "Is that really Grace Whitmore?" I smiled gently. "Yes," I answered. She looked at me for another moment before asking, "The Grace Whitmore?" I nodded again. Before she could continue, Grace turned around once more. "Andrew," she said, "before we begin, I wanted to personally thank you for the strategy materials your team sent earlier this week. Our executive committee reviewed everything yesterday. We were genuinely impressed. Several recommendations challenged our own assumptions in exactly the way we hoped they would." I thanked her, explaining that my team believed every client deserved careful preparation before the first official meeting. Grace smiled again. "That philosophy is exactly why we are here." Those words settled over the room with remarkable weight. They were not spoken loudly, yet they carried more meaning than any compliment I had ever received publicly. My father heard every word. My mother did as well. Neither of them interrupted. Rachel discreetly closed the conference room door behind us, leaving my parents in the reception area for a few moments before they quietly prepared to leave. Through the glass wall separating the conference room from the reception area, I noticed my father looking around the office again. This time his eyes lingered on details he had ignored earlier. The organized research shelves, the framed letters of appreciation from nonprofit organizations, the awards recognizing community leadership rather than personal wealth. Nothing inside the office had changed during the past 15 minutes. Only his understanding had begun to change. Once everyone had taken their seats, Grace opened her portfolio and placed several documents on the table. "Before we discuss the future," she said, "I would like to explain why we selected your firm. We interviewed larger companies. Some had offices 10 times this size. Others had hundreds of consultants across multiple states. Every one of them presented impressive statistics and polished presentations. Your proposal felt different." I listened carefully without interrupting. Grace continued, "Your recommendations focused almost entirely on our customers, our employees, and the long-term health of our company. You never tried to impress us. You tried to help us. That difference was impossible to ignore. Hearing those words reminded me why I had resisted building a business around appearances. Clients who valued substance eventually recognized substance. Outside the conference room, I saw my parents finally walking toward the elevator. My father paused one last time before the doors opened. He looked through the glass at the ongoing meeting, then quietly lowered his eyes for a moment before stepping inside beside my mother. Neither of them waved. Neither of them spoke. Yet something in their expressions told me they were leaving with far more questions than they had brought with them. As the elevator doors closed, Grace looked across the table and said, "Andrew, if today's conversation goes as well as I believe it will, this may become one of the most important partnerships our company has formed in many years." I smiled calmly, opened my notebook, and replied, "Then let us make sure we build it the right way from the very beginning." The meeting lasted nearly 4 hours, yet not a single minute felt wasted. Grace Whitmore and her executive team approached every discussion with thoughtful questions, and I appreciated that they challenged ideas instead of simply accepting them. We analyzed customer research, reviewed long-term brand positioning, discussed company culture, and explored strategies that would strengthen trust with both employees and consumers. By the time the afternoon sunlight shifted across the conference room windows, I realized the conversation had become far more collaborative than I had expected. We were no longer discussing whether we should work together. We were discussing how we would build something meaningful together over the coming years. Near the end of the presentation, Grace leaned back in her chair and smiled. "Andrew," she said, "I have worked with consultants across the country for more than 20 years. Many of them knew how to create attractive presentations. Very few understood how to ask the difficult questions that actually improve a business. Your recommendations have done exactly that." I thanked her sincerely because praise from someone with her experience carried genuine weight. She continued by explaining that several members of her board had independently recommended my firm before she ever contacted me personally. Some had worked with executives who quietly credited our strategic guidance for helping them navigate major periods of growth. Others had simply heard my name repeated by people they respected. Every recommendation pointed toward the same conclusion. My company earned trust by consistently delivering thoughtful work instead of seeking public attention. That reputation had taken years to build, one relationship at a time. Grace closed the final folder on the conference table and looked around at her colleagues. "Unless anyone has concerns," she said, "I believe we are ready to move forward." Her team exchanged brief smiles before agreeing without hesitation. She then reached into her portfolio and removed a formal engagement agreement that had already been prepared by her legal department. "We normally spend several additional weeks negotiating details," she explained. "In this case, we have already completed most of that process internally because we came here expecting to begin a partnership, not merely another interview." Rachel entered quietly with fresh coffee as the documents were placed on the table. She smiled when she realized what was happening, but continued working professionally as always. Grace signed the agreement first before sliding it across the table toward me. As I reviewed each page carefully, I felt a quiet sense of gratitude rather than excitement. Moments like this rarely belonged to one extraordinary day. They represented the accumulated result of countless ordinary days spent honoring commitments, improving skills, and protecting trust even when nobody appeared to notice. After confirming every detail, I signed the agreement and shook Grace's hand once again. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly. "I believe this partnership will accomplish remarkable things." We spent another hour outlining the first phase of the project, establishing communication schedules, assigning responsibilities, and identifying immediate priorities. Grace insisted that I communicate directly with her whenever major strategic decisions required discussion. She explained that too many organizations lost momentum because information traveled through unnecessary layers before reaching leadership. Direct communication, she believed, created better decisions and stronger accountability. I agreed completely because that philosophy reflected the way I had always managed my own business. As the meeting finally concluded, Rachel escorted our guests toward the reception area. Before leaving, Grace paused beside the front entrance and looked back toward my office. "One more thing," she said. "When I met your parents earlier today, I told them they should be proud of you. I hope they believed me because I meant every word." Her comment caught me slightly by surprise. I smiled and thanked her again. Families sometimes need time to understand journeys they did not witness, I replied. Grace nodded thoughtfully. That is true, she said. People often mistake quiet confidence for a lack of ambition. Eventually, results speak more clearly than explanations ever could. After they departed, the office became unusually quiet. Rachel walked into my office carrying a copy of the signed agreement and placed it carefully on my desk. Congratulations, she said. This is the biggest partnership we have ever signed. I looked at the folder for a moment before placing it inside a locked cabinet with every other confidential client file. It is an important beginning, I answered. But now we have to earn the confidence they have placed in us. Rachel smiled because she had expected exactly that response. You really are incapable of celebrating before the work begins, she joked. I laughed softly. The celebration comes when the client succeeds. After Rachel left for the evening, I remained alone in the office organizing notes from the day's discussions. My phone vibrated on the desk. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I answered immediately. Her voice sounded different from usual. There was no casual conversation, no cheerful small talk, only a thoughtful pause before she finally spoke. Your father has been very quiet since we left your office today, she said. He has barely mentioned anything else all afternoon. I listened without interrupting. He keeps saying he did not realize what you had built, she continued. I do not think either of us understood. I told her there was nothing to worry about, and that I had never expected them to understand every detail of my work. She hesitated before asking one more question. Was today really as important as it looked? I smiled as I looked across the now empty conference room, where only a few coffee cups remained from the meeting. Yes, I answered honestly. It was one of the most important days my company has ever had. My mother remained silent for a few seconds before quietly saying, I think your father would like to talk with you soon. After we ended the call, I turned off the office lights one by one and locked the front door behind me. As I walked toward my old pickup truck waiting exactly where it had always been, I realized nothing about my life looked different from the outside. The same office stood behind me. The same truck waited in the parking space. The same simple routine continued. Yet somewhere across town, my parents were beginning to see that the life they had underestimated had been far richer than appearances had ever allowed them to imagine. The next afternoon, I drove to my parents' house for the family lunch my mother had mentioned earlier in the week. The same familiar maple trees shaded the front yard, the same wind chimes hung beside the porch, and the same old wooden swing rested near the flower garden where my mother spent so many spring mornings. Everything looked exactly as it always had, yet I could already sense something had changed before I even walked through the front door. My father was usually the first to greet me with a joke or a question about work, but this time he simply opened the door, smiled quietly, and stepped aside so I could come in. His expression carried none of the confidence he normally displayed whenever conversations turned toward careers or financial success. Instead, he looked thoughtful, almost as though he had been replaying the previous day's events in his mind ever since leaving my office. My mother welcomed me with a warm hug before returning to the kitchen to finish preparing lunch. Emily and her husband arrived a few minutes later, bringing dessert as they usually did. We gathered around the dining table, talking about ordinary things at first. The weather had finally begun warming after a long stretch of cool mornings. Emily mentioned plans for a weekend trip with her family. My mother described a community fundraiser she was helping organize. My father listened more than he spoke, occasionally nodding but never steering the conversation the way he usually did. Eventually, Emily noticed the unusual silence. Dad, you are quieter than normal today, she said with a smile. Everything all right? My father looked across the table before answering. Your mother and I visited Andrew's office yesterday. Emily looked toward me with mild curiosity. Really? How was it? Before I could answer, my father continued. It was educational. The single word made everyone smile, but there was sincerity behind it. Emily laughed softly. Educational sounds mysterious. My mother gently placed a bowl on the table before sitting down beside him. We happened to arrive just before one of Andrew's clients, she explained. Not just any client, my father added quietly. Grace Whitmore. Emily's smile disappeared almost instantly. Grace Whitmore? The chief executive officer? She asked. My father nodded slowly. The very same. For a brief moment the room became completely silent. Emily looked back and forth between me and my parents as though waiting for someone to explain how such a meeting had happened. You work with her company? She asked. I smiled politely. We recently agreed to begin working together. Emily leaned back in her chair, clearly surprised. Why have you never mentioned that? She asked. Or any of the other companies you work with? I shrugged gently. Because my clients trust me to keep their business private. Their confidence means more than public recognition. Emily lowered her eyes for a moment before quietly saying, I never thought about it that way. Lunch continued, but the atmosphere felt completely different from previous family gatherings. Nobody compared houses. Nobody mentioned new vehicles or expensive purchases. Instead, the questions centered around ideas, leadership, and the kind of work I actually enjoyed doing. My father listened carefully every time I answered, almost as though he were discovering an entirely new person sitting across the table. After we finished eating, my mother cleared several dishes while Emily helped in the kitchen. My father asked whether I would join him on the back porch for a few minutes. We stepped outside together, settling into two old wooden chairs overlooking the yard where I had played baseball as a child. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass through the neighborhood. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, my father folded his hands together and looked out across the lawn instead of directly at me. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Hearing those words surprised me more than I expected. My father had always been a proud man, not stubborn in an unkind way, but slow to admit when he had been mistaken. I remained silent, giving him the space to continue. Yesterday changed something for me, he said. Not because of Grace Whitmore herself, but because of the way she spoke about you. She respected you. She trusted your judgment. I realized I had spent years judging your life by things that had nothing to do with the quality of your work or your character. He paused before taking a slow breath. I kept looking at your truck, your townhouse, and your office. I never stopped to ask whether those things were choices instead of limitations. I smiled gently. They were choices, I answered. He nodded. I understand that now. Another quiet moment passed before he continued. I thought I was encouraging you to become successful. Looking back, I was really encouraging you to look successful. Those words carried more honesty than anything he had ever said to me about my career. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. I know you always wanted the best for me, I said. I never doubted that. My father finally looked directly at me. Still, I should have trusted you more. I should have realized that success does not always announce itself with expensive things. We sat together for several more minutes without feeling the need to fill every silence. The conversation did not erase years of misunderstanding, but it created something far more valuable than an argument ever could have. It created understanding. Before we returned inside, my father smiled in a way I had not seen for a long time. You know, he said, I spent years trying to teach you about work. It looks like life decided you would end up teaching me instead. I laughed quietly as we walked back toward the house together, both of us recognizing that the strongest lessons often arrive long after we believe we already know the answers. The weeks that followed brought changes so gradual that someone outside the family might never have noticed them. Yet to me, they felt remarkable. My father's opinions no longer arrived as quiet judgments disguised as advice. Instead, they came as sincere questions asked with genuine curiosity. Every Sunday afternoon, he called to ask how the Whitmore project was progressing, not because he wanted to know how much money the contract was worth, but because he had become interested in the work itself. He wanted to understand how businesses made difficult decisions, why executives sought outside perspectives, and what separated companies that continued growing from those that slowly disappeared. For the first time in my adult life, our conversations centered on ideas instead of appearances. One Saturday morning, he asked whether I could stop by his automotive shop before opening hours. I arrived just after 8 carrying 2 cups of coffee. The building had barely changed since I was a teenager. The familiar smell of motor oil mixed with fresh coffee instantly reminded me of the countless weekends I had spent sweeping floors and organizing tools while learning the value of honest work. My father welcomed me with a smile before leading me into his small office overlooking the service bays. He spread several papers across his desk and looked slightly embarrassed. I have been thinking about something, he admitted. For years, I believed my reputation alone would keep customers coming back. Lately, I have realized the market is changing. New repair shops keep opening, and younger customers expect different experiences. He paused before looking at me. Would you mind giving me your opinion? Hearing those words meant more than he probably realized. My father had built his business through decades of hard work and personal integrity. Asking for advice was not easy for him because he had always been the person others depended on. I sat beside him and carefully reviewed everything he had prepared. We spent nearly 3 hours discussing customer communication, appointment scheduling, online reviews, community partnerships, and simple ways to strengthen long-term relationships without sacrificing the personal service that had always defined his shop. None of the ideas required expensive renovations or flashy advertising campaigns. They focused on making every customer feel respected from the moment they scheduled an appointment until the moment they drove away. My father listened carefully, occasionally taking notes exactly as I had done during meetings with my own clients. Before I left, he folded the notebook, closed, and smiled. You know what surprises me most? He asked. None of your suggestions involve spending a fortune. I laughed quietly. Good strategy almost never begins with spending more money, I replied. It begins with understanding people better. He nodded slowly, repeating the sentence as though committing it to memory. A few days later, my mother invited me to dinner again, but this evening felt completely different from the gatherings we had shared for years. Emily was already there when I arrived, and instead of teasing me about finally buying a newer truck, she walked outside to look at it with genuine curiosity. You really could replace this anytime you wanted, could not you? She asked with a smile. I laughed. Probably. She looked at the old pickup for another moment before shaking her head. I spent years assuming you kept driving it because you had no choice. Most people did, I answered honestly. Then why keep it? She asked. I smiled as I rested one hand against the driver's door. Because every month it keeps running saves money that can be invested somewhere more valuable. Besides, I have never believed a vehicle should become someone's identity. Emily laughed softly. I think I finally understand why you always seemed so calm, while everyone else worried about impressing people. During dinner, my mother surprised everyone by sharing something she had quietly realized after visiting my office. She admitted she had spent years believing successful people naturally surrounded themselves with luxury because that was how magazines, television programs, and advertisements portrayed achievement. Meeting Grace Whitmore had challenged that belief completely. She was confident without trying to impress anyone, my mother said. Then I realized Andrew behaves exactly the same way. My father smiled in agreement before adding, confidence and showing off are not the same thing. I confused them for a very long time. The conversation drifted naturally toward memories from my childhood. We laughed about old family vacations, school projects, and my first attempts at helping in my father's repair shop. Somewhere during those stories, I realized the tension that had quietly existed for years had almost completely disappeared. Nobody felt the need to compare careers or lifestyles anymore. Instead, we simply enjoyed being together. Later that evening, as everyone prepared to leave, Emily stopped beside me near the front porch. Can I ask you something? She said. Of course. She hesitated before continuing. Do you ever regret not living the way everyone expected? I looked toward the quiet neighborhood where porch lights had begun glowing beneath the evening sky. Not once, I answered. If I had spent my life trying to satisfy other people's expectations, I probably would have missed the opportunity to build the life that actually suited me. Emily smiled thoughtfully. I think that might be the best advice anyone has ever given me. As I drove home through the peaceful streets, I reflected on how strange life could be. Nothing visible about my world had changed very much. I still lived in the same townhouse. I still drove the same aging pickup. My office remained the same modest workspace where meaningful conversations happened behind simple glass doors. Yet everything important had changed because the people closest to me had finally begun looking beyond appearances. They had discovered that real success was never hidden from them. They had simply been looking in the wrong place all along. Several months passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and quietly transformed. The partnership with Whitmore Global Enterprises continued to grow beyond anything I had originally imagined. Every completed milestone led to another challenge, and every challenge strengthened the trust we had built together. Grace Whitmore remained exactly the leader I had first met. She valued thoughtful conversations over impressive speeches, careful planning over unnecessary urgency, and lasting results over temporary attention. Working alongside her team reminded me every day that the most accomplished people often carried themselves with the greatest humility. At the same time, something equally meaningful was happening outside the office. My relationship with my family had become lighter, warmer, and more honest than it had been in years. One Sunday afternoon, my parents invited everyone to celebrate my father's birthday. As I pulled my old pickup truck into the driveway, I smiled to myself because nothing about my arrival looked any different from countless family gatherings before. The truck still carried a few scratches from years of use. My clothes remained simple and comfortable. I had not suddenly adopted an expensive lifestyle simply because my business had reached another level of success. When I stepped inside, my father greeted me with a broad smile and immediately asked everyone to gather in the living room before dinner. I assumed he wanted to thank everyone for coming, but instead he looked directly at me. "Before we eat," he said, "there is something I want to say." The room became quiet. My mother smiled gently, already knowing what he planned to share. Emily looked curious as she sat beside her husband on the sofa. My father took a slow breath before speaking. "For a long time I believed success had to be visible. I believed expensive things proved that someone had made good decisions. I was wrong." He glanced toward me with complete sincerity. Andrew never argued with me. He never tried to embarrass me or prove me wrong. He simply kept living according to his principles until the results spoke for themselves. I spent years trying to teach him what success looked like. Instead, he taught me what success actually is. Hearing those words in front of the entire family meant more than any public recognition I had ever received. My father was not apologizing because he felt pressured. He was acknowledging that people can continue learning at any stage of life if they are willing to remain humble. Emily smiled warmly before adding, "I learned something too. I used to think confidence came from owning impressive things. Now I think confidence comes from knowing you do not need them." We all laughed softly, and the conversation naturally shifted towards stories from the past. The evening felt effortless in a way that family gatherings rarely had before. Nobody competed. Nobody compared. Everyone simply enjoyed being together. A few weeks later, my father called and asked whether I could stop by his automotive shop after work. When I arrived, he proudly showed me several improvements inspired by our earlier conversations. The waiting area had been refreshed with comfortable seating and complimentary coffee. Customers now received follow-up messages thanking them for their business and reminding them about future maintenance appointments. Local reviews had improved significantly, and new customers were arriving through recommendations rather than expensive advertising. My father smiled like a young entrepreneur discovering business for the first time. "You were right," he admitted. "People remember how you make them feel more than how impressive your building looks." I laughed and reminded him that his honesty and hard work had always been the true strengths of the business. The changes simply helped more people notice those qualities. Before I left, he placed one hand on my shoulder. "I am proud of the business you built," he said, "but I am even prouder of the man you became while building it." Those words stayed with me long after I drove away. Looking back now, I realized the greatest victory was never signing a contract with one of the country's most respected companies. It was never the financial success that followed or the opportunities that continued opening afterward. The greatest victory was discovering that quiet consistency could change hearts more effectively than loud arguments ever could. If I had spent years trying to convince my family that I was successful, they probably would have resisted every explanation. Instead, I allowed patience, integrity, and steady work to tell the story in their own time. People often ask whether I eventually bought a larger house or replaced my old pickup truck. The truth usually surprises them. I still lived comfortably without chasing luxury for its own sake, and I drove that dependable truck until it finally reached the end of its long and faithful service. When I eventually replaced it, I chose another practical vehicle that suited my life instead of my image. Some habits never needed changing because they had never been signs of limitation. They had always been reflections of my priorities. If there is one lesson my journey taught me, it is this: never measure your worth by the opinions of people who only see the surface of your life. The choices that seem ordinary today may be quietly building the future everyone else will admire tomorrow. Real success does not ask for attention. It earns respect through character, patience, and consistent action. Eventually, the people who truly matter will stop looking at what you own and start appreciating who you have become. In the end, that kind of success is worth far more than anything. money alone could ever buy.